Sponsored by Students and Youth for a New America. We're a socialist organization established 2 years ago for the purpose of building a better future for the working people of this country. We ask that there be no live streaming during the event, but people are welcome to tweet and take pictures using the hashtag NewAmerica. A high-quality video of this event will be posted online, and we want to thank filmmaker Steve Gong for recording tonight's events. To start off our forum, we will have a few words from our special guest, Sander Hicks. He's the editor of the New York City Megaphone, a progressive newspaper that was just relaunched, and was kind enough to feature an advertisement promoting tonight's forum. Sander Hicks is a well-known progressive writer, and he's run for office several times, opposing wars and challenging mainstream media narratives.
Hello everybody, I'm Sander Hicks. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you Caleb and Students for a New America. Students and Youth for a New America for sponsoring this. So I've traveled the country and spoken to numerous audiences, mostly about anti-war and 9/11 truth topics, but I've never actually had the opportunity to speak as a socialist on socialism. So this is totally historic for me, and I'm really honored to be here tonight. I am the publisher of the New York Megaphone. It's a free newspaper, and there's copies at the desk, and if we have time, we can talk a little bit more about what's in the paper and why I'm redoing this paper that I did 10 years ago. But I only have about 15, 20-ish minutes, maybe 15 minutes to speak. So I just want to say what my topic's going to be for this short speech, and then do it, and then get the heck off the stage. So I decided to speak about Socialism 2.0 Maverick style. It's 2018, and we obviously have a system in deep crisis. We have people talking about the deep state. We have people talking about that this is probably the worst president we've ever had. He's connected to mafia. He's connected to a level of international criminality. He is an uber capitalist. He's a fascist. And I'm not here just to talk about the president, because the president is just a symptom of a system that's in deep crisis. So the only thing that I think that can really analyze Trump is to talk about capitalism, and talk about the crisis of capitalism, and talk about the fact that the people are waking up. Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring to a certain extent, and the recent electoral victories that we cover in the Megaphone of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Julia Salazar for state senate show that actually the old models of socialist victory, i.e. there has to be socialist victory only through an armed revolution, are not necessarily sacrosanct, are not necessarily true anymore. That we can actually win at the ballot box. We can actually win through nonviolent social change. And so I would say that Socialism 2.0 has to be willing to embrace winning, has to be open to the possibility of winning, and has to be open to the possibility that violence equals death, and violence equals losing, and that violence actually turns your audience against you. So Mahatma Gandhi defeated imperialism very quickly, and Martin Luther King defeated American racism very quickly by kind of subverting what it meant to be a revolutionary, and by still being very confrontational and still being very in some ways traditionally revolutionary. But I would say that they were open to using something inside Western civilization. And I would say that King and Gandhi were trying to find the revolutionary potential inside of the religions of their day. And so Socialism 2.0, I think the socialism of the future needs to be able to be in dialogue with mainstream religion. Not because I'm trying to proselytize for any one religion here, not at all. But I'm trying to say that I think the socialism of the future is going to have to be emancipatory and deeply radical about the fact that there is something emancipatory and deeply radical in all the world's great religions. And so Gandhi found this inside of Christianity and Hinduism and was able to use that to overthrow imperialism really quickly. So I think that these are things that actually make the revolutionary movement extremely powerful. If we can get away from stereotypes of what it is to be a leftist and embrace a more holistic vision of what it means to be a revolutionary. You know, a revolutionary who's able to be in dialogue with, let's say, Christians. You know, I say the word Christian, and you probably, your skin goes cold, right? You think about the American right wing. You think about people like Judge Kavanaugh, right? Look at the way that he reacted. Under oath, he clearly lied. He clearly perjured himself. He committed the crime of perjury under oath, and was extremely defensive. Clearly, the man's an alcoholic. He has all the signs of alcoholism.
What perjury did he commit?
I don't have the time to go into it, Daniel, since I only have 15 minutes, but I'm willing to take questions afterwards. Judge Kavanaugh clearly lied, and the evidence is very strong. What strikes me, being from DC, about Kavanaugh is that he's like part and parcel of the American mainstream Catholicism that I grew up in and eventually escaped from. This idea of Christianity as this kind of self-righteous ideology that has absolutely none of the humility that somebody like Martin Luther King or Gandhi has, right? So it becomes, from the standpoint of Marx, it becomes an opiate of the masses, an illusion, right? As opposed to the essence, I feel, of a truly revolutionary practice would see that, let me break it down to an anecdote. My Aunt Sandy is this born-again Christian in Philadelphia. When I told her I was speaking at this event, she sent me this email that said, "Socialism has never worked. Show me a place where it's worked." And you know what I did? Instead of trying to talk about economic models of various countries throughout the world, I went to the Acts of the Apostles, where the early church actually is in this amazing frame of mind, and they shared things communally. The early church was actually a socialist model. So if any right-wing Christian says that there's no way that socialism would work, you can say, well, actually, do you know your history, that the history of the early church was actually a pure working socialist model? And if you want to cite chapter and verse, and if you're taking notes, it's Acts 2 through 5. And I felt this was a great, effective way to connect to Christians. You know, this is something that was effective for Martin Luther King. When they had to confront racism, they used the churches. You know, there's these organizations that are already out there. We have this potential in front of us. Now that people are beginning to win elections as socialists, you know, the DSA is a group that has now swelled to 50,000 members. I personally am a member as well. This group could grow up to be 100,000 members. You know, we have this incredible creative potential. One thing I learned recently from my friends in an organization that's here now is that we have this divine light inside all of us, this universal divine light. And what is it? It's the ability to be creative, right? So whether or not you're an atheist, a Marxist, or somebody who has a spirituality, there's a universal truth about humanity, that we all have this incredible creative potential. So through the power of language, if we create the possibility that we can have a movement that's going to connect to each other, that's going to connect to Christians and Buddhists and atheists and Marxists, then that would be a movement that I think would be unstoppable, right? If we declare the possibility that this group, Students and Youth for a New America, which is a great name, by the way, because you're declaring the possibility that this country can be renewed, right? That it doesn't have to be the country of racism, rape, oppression, patriarchy, lies, cover-ups, deep FBI corruption, deep Pentagon corruption, right? That we can actually say that America can be new, that America can be a country of equality and opportunity, the working class actually having real economic power. Are you with me on that?
Yeah!
Yeah! So that's my brief vision for Socialism 2.0, Maverick style, and I can take questions at the end of the evening, and make sure you grab yourself a megaphone, and I think that's it, right? Am I out of time?
Thank you, Sander. Now we'll have a musical performance from Paul Shepard. Paul is a poet, writer, and musician who lives in Washington, D.C.
Now, some of you might remember this song, so if you know it, just sing along if you know the words. You'll hear from the boss, you'll hear from the banker. If you go to your mother, will you tell her that we thank her? She worked all her life and she wore down her health to raise us a wage slave, much like herself. But when we're free, you will see that the future belongs to the worker. You'll hear from the liars in the corridors of power how lucky you are to toil hour after hour, how lucky you are to be breaking your back so the leeches on Wall Street can stay in the black. Oh, but when we're free, when we see that the future belongs to the worker, and high up above, looking down from their plane, the rich ones luxuriate in ill-gotten gain. They strangle the weak, they devour the poor, and as much as they have, they will always want more. We slept so long, soon we'll be strong, 'cause the future belongs to the worker. Awakened American worker.
Thank you, Paul. Now we will have a presentation from Maddie McAllister. She's a leader of the Boston branch of Students and Youth for a New America. She has been involved in all kinds of progressive protests and demonstrations, and has widely distributed leaflets challenging the lies about Syria to her fellow high school students. Her presentation tonight will focus on the opioid crisis.
I think it's very important that we are coming together tonight to talk about solutions to fix our country's political climate. Political dissidence is at an all-time high, more so than ever. Young people are questioning the system of capitalism, especially after the 2016 elections, where one of the most popular candidates ran as a Democratic Socialist. Bernie Sanders is one of the most popular politicians in the U.S., and that's no coincidence that young people love him so much. We can and must work together to come up with solutions for what we can do in order to save our country from those who have been in power for too long. Neither Democrat or Republican represent our interests. A man named Huey Long once said back in 1932 that God had a set of Republican waiters on one side and a set of Democratic waiters on the other side. But no matter which set of waiters brings you the dish, the legislative grub is always prepared in the same Wall Street kitchen. This quote still stands true to this day. We are having these discussions because the future is in our hands, and it is our duty to take back what is ours. We are the ones who create the profit, and we are the workers that make societies function. And we do not deserve to eat off the crumbs off the place of the politicians, bankers, or 1% any longer. While the police state strangles our freedoms away, locks up 2 million people while shooting first and asking questions later, the richest country in the world suffers from extreme poverty. And I'm sure when you leave this building tonight, you'll see that. Our education and healthcare systems are privatized and fundings are cut. Only the ones with wealth are able to comfortably get the basic human needs that everyone needs. We spend trillions on war overseas while destabilizing the rest of the world. And tonight I want to talk to you about an American health epidemic. We see it every day when we walk down the streets. It's plaguing our communities and killing our fellow working class brothers and sisters. My own town has been hit hard by this crisis. I come from a suburban town outside of Boston, a small town where everyone knows everyone. Bristol County was one of the hardest counties hit in Massachusetts between January 2013 and September 2015. From early 2013 to late 2015, Mansfield police received 58 calls related to opiate overdoses. 23 of those cases, the opiate was heroin. So most of these deaths are related from your prescription pill cabinets. I recall talking to my old English teacher about how I wanted to give this speech. He told me he had been to multiple funerals for past students in the span of the last 5 years related from opioid overdoses, some of which were star athletes at one point in my school. We see people getting started with prescription painkillers, people getting hooked on pills that are supposed to treat your health, not make it worse. They end up exceeding their habit from $200 to $300 per day, so they shift to something cheaper, street drugs such as heroin. I've had friends' parents pass away from this crisis. Most of the time, someone will get hurt on the job. Doctors will prescribe them pain meds. In a matter of weeks, you're hooked. Without them, you can't seem to function normally. And in the end, people's lives are taken away from them. I can also recall having a friend's mother of mine had become a victim of the war on drugs and was facing jail time while still addicted. She had been withdrawing her first week while incarcerated, asked for help from the prison staff multiple times, but ended up passing away from a seizure in her bunk. Time and time again, we know that jail time does not fix addictions for addicts. They come out and the first thing on their mind is still their addiction. You should be funding rehabilitation centers for everyone, not just those who can afford luxury rehab facilities in California to get treatment. And I would like to remind you that this drug epidemic is nothing new. Our country has been addicted for decades now. In the 1960s, heroin and other drugs were just as much of a problem as they are now. Veterans from the Vietnam War would come home still addicted from using heroin to numb their pain while in combat. During the year 1969 in New York alone, there were over 900 deaths resulting from drug addiction. Out of these, 210 were youth ranging from 12 to 19. These numbers have grown into the thousands. While the war on drugs rages on, the drug epidemic does not seem to be put to a stop. And the industrial prison complex only has grown larger. The opioid crisis kills on average 115 Americans a day from overdoses. Official government studies estimate over 700,000 deaths since 1999. And many others that go undocumented. U.S. opioid use is the highest in any country in the world, more than 50% higher than Germany, which comes in second. 95% of the world's opioids are consumed here in the States. Life expectancy has even declined in the United States for 2 years in a row, fueled by increasing death rates from the opioid drug overdoses. U.S. life expectancy from 78.7 in 2015 to 78.6 in 2016. Compared to Cuba, which has a life expectancy rate of 79.9 and continues to grow. And as other countries' morality rates are decreasing, America's is increasing. We are losing generations of young Americans to this crisis. How come as technology and medical advancements are being made, quality of life declines here? It's because in a capitalist society, we put profit over bettering society as a collective as a whole. And does anyone know where most of the world's opium comes from?
Afghanistan.
As heroin use grows in the United States, poppy crops thrive in Afghanistan, the same country that has been occupying, the same country we have been occupying for almost my entire lifespan. And the coincidence, there's no coincidence in that. In 2014, opioids were involved in 28,647 deaths. 61% of those were overdose deaths from opioids. That rate has tripled since 2000, and the numbers are increasing at alarming rates. In 2017, the number increased to 49,000. Opioids are more deadly than firearms and car crashes in the States. The increase in opioid addiction is directly related to our labor force participation. People are no longer working because of this crisis. Numbers have fallen in areas where opioid pain medication is prescribed the most. An estimated 15% of construction workers suffer from substance abuse, and the escalating cost of Suboxone, which is a drug that helps you get off of opioids, but it's just as addicting. And and other forms of narcotic addiction treatment threaten to bankrupt the health plans of several building unions. The numbers prescribed opioids in this country would be able to give every man, woman, and child in this country a 30-day supply. The workforce in the United States is addicted. This epidemic has become so overwhelming that funeral directors all across America are asking for something to be done because of how many coffins of people are coming in from opioid overdoses. Over the past decade, out-of-state drug companies shipped 20.8 million prescription painkillers to 2 pharmacies 4 blocks away from each other. And this occurred in the town of southern West Virginia with a population of only 2,900 people. Massive shipments of hydrocodone and oxycodone, 2 powerful painkillers, came to the town of Williamson. And this is happening to thousands of towns all across the United States, including my own. The biggest drug dealers in our country are the pharmaceutical companies, and they deserve to serve time just like anyone else that has become a victim to the war on drugs. Now, when it comes to the Justice Department, DEA, they don't blame economic issues on this crisis. I read an article yesterday that the title was, Justice Department claims that emo rap is responsible for the opioid crisis, which is a scapegoat just as ridiculous as saying rock and roll is the devil 60 to 50 years ago. The problem is rooted in economic inequality. Over 2 decades, the increasing numbers of opioid deaths were neglected by each political parties. Doctors and hospital directors were either actively complicit or in denial. However, the FDA continued to approve, manufacture, and promote prescriptively habit-forming narcotics and sedatives to millions of American patients, without the warning of possible side effects. Big Pharma earns billions in profits despite the devastation. Between 1999 and 2014, pharmaceutical makers were earning $10 billion each year in profits from the sale and distribution of opiates. Nowadays, we acknowledge that the opioid crisis is a problem, but the solutions come up short. People are not looking at the bigger issue. A lot of imprisonment, high-priced personal addiction treatment centers, volunteer support groups, aid courses, just say no campaigns. However, as a socialist, I say we need to be educating victims regarding the socio-economic trends and those who own the pharmaceutical companies that blasted their communities and poisoned Americans with addiction and eventually death. Multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies manufacture and market narcotics and extremely habit-forming sedatives. Their companies manipulate the health professions and lobby among the politicians for a pain-free America. The producer of leading business gateway into addiction, oxycodone, is Purdue. The corporation was based and run entirely by the Slacker family. They started producing laxatives and earwax and introducing extremely habit-forming tranquilizers, to finally manufacturing and pushing the foremost profitable prescription medicine in history, oxycodone. Within the 1990s, throughout President Bill Clinton's healthcare reform, many pharmaceutical firms began to sharply selling opioids to treat chronic but not acute pain, claiming they carried very little risk to addiction. The foremost distributor of those drug companies was Purdue, among many others. The Slacker family's web value rose to over $14 billion, according to Forbes billionaires list, whereas Purdue prescribed drugs reaped over $35 billion and exploit to sell oxycodone. Following Slacker's example, alternative drug company billionaires joined the slaughter and deaths and mayhem increased. Opioid pain medication was thus low cost to supply and had created its own ever-expanding demand as teenagers raided grandmothers' pill cabinets in search of narcotics and poor staff lined up at pill mills. Oxycodone and its siblings made the best ratio in the pharmaceutical history. President and Congress, Democrats and Republicans, unnoticed this epidemic, and as a result, they were bought off by their campaign donors at Big Pharma. Over the past 20 years, the political elite received millions in campaign funds from massive pharmaceutical company lobbies together with politicians from states raged by prescription narcotics. The prescription narcotic and succeeding illegal narcotic addiction epidemic has become a $1 million business. Now, if government-funded rehabilitation centers or self-help like rehabs that cost thousands of dollars that not every working class person can afford, what is the solution? I'd say socialism. The link between capitalism and drug reaches back to the center of the 19th century, when the British Empire forced opioid crops from their South Asian colonies into the Chinese market, making large demand and a population that became addicted. The famous Opium War in 1839 forced China to accept opium brought on English ships. Malcolm X once wrote, "Imagine, declare war upon someone who objects to being narcotized." The Chinese government that had prohibited the use and sale of narcotics was afraid of growing social chaos created by mass addiction and visited war from the Western powers to halt the flood of medication. Their defeat at the hands of land and their Chinese drug allies opened China to a large exploitation and pillage for a century. Chinese narcotic addicts were an obstacle to organizing national resistance. Its imperial protectors reworked China into the history's poorest country till an earth-shattering revolution stone broke the chains of addiction. Within the 21st century, the same method of decay has been occurring internally within the United States. The prescription opioid epidemic is ravaging families, neighborhoods, communities, cities, states, particularly in working class communities. Now it's overflowed into the suburban towns and many mining and former producing Rust Belt regions. Many thousands of largely working class victims have died and have been left addicted to opioids. Unable to resist the destruction of their futures and have replaced a once powerful working class America. The addiction crisis is a class war waged on by those who profit off of it. Those who suffer are the ones who give everything to feed their addiction. The real, if not expressed, consequences of their trade has been to cull the population, render by the elite economic and political sections of our society, destroy the capability of their victims. Members of the family, neighbors, and friends don't know that organizing and unify to fight back the slaughter of their communities. How did China fix the opiate problem? The Chinese Revolution of 1949 took charge in prosecuting and punishment of the warlord-controlled substance entrepreneurs. Addicts were restored and came back to their communities and planned to create a new society. The Communist Party of China, when it first took power, served the people for the first time, not the oppressors. It was possible for the people to organize in their own interest to solve those problems. For months after the revolution, the Mass Lion campaign took on drug addiction. This campaign did not rely on social workers talking down to people or on punishments of jail time. It wasn't about buying your way through drug rehabilitation. It was not about individual solutions through one-on-one therapy. It's not about filling prisons with addicts while allowing the capitalist class to get rich off the drug trade. It was about real solutions. It was about stopping the terrible addiction to slavery to addiction to drugs, and stopping the drug trade that profited off people's suffering. And lots of other oppression was wiped out too. After the revolution, China got rid of prostitution, brutal poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, domestic violence, crime, police brutality, and so on. The revolution completely changed people's lives, and it led to do things that were unthinkable only a couple years before. Likewise, in the 1959 revolution in Cuba, drug dens and brothels were cracked down by the revolutionary leadership. The primary step in an effective cure to this crisis would need an organization of mass movements dedicated to anti-drug lawyers, physicians, medical personnel, and community organizers, community leaders, and a real concern about national wellness. Not a mouthpiece for for company elite. Increased kid and maternal mortality and deaths are preventable if we put our minds to it. We need a planned government and economy that puts our needs first before profit. How much longer are the American people going to let the ruling class of this country kill our country and the rest of the world? I think it's time that we take back what is ours and start planning our futures together.
Thank you, Maddie. Before we move on to our keynote speech, we will have another musical performance from Paul Shepard. After that, Paul will give a special introduction for our speaker that he has prepared.
To be a drum, hear the voice of freedom. These words were never mine alone, they're from the voice of freedom. And every hour of every day, you have to toil your life away. Is that much harder I will pray? You hear the voice of freedom. The parasite today enthroned fears the voice of freedom. See him tremble at the sound of the voice of freedom. But to confound his every scheme and take control of his machine, then you'd know what freedom means. Sings the voice of freedom. When I tell you what it is, it's the voice of freedom. Our lives are made for more than this, they were made for freedom. Our lives are made for liberty, not broken back and usury. So much more this life could be. Hear the voice of freedom. I have had the joy of friendship with Caleb for a few years now, so have some of you. But I won't preach to the choir about his brilliant mind, his originality, or his courage. I will say that I've never read, let alone met, anyone living who better combines such eloquence, deep learning, and passionate commitment into so timely and powerful a voice. And in fact, it's, I think, the very voice that our country needs right now to break its fever and wake up. Now, let's have a show of hands here. I know this sounds random, but who here has ever stayed up all night? Yes. Stayed up all night long.
Oh yeah.
Many times, right? Now, so think about what the first sound before the morning is. I'm from the country, so maybe my experience is different than some of yours. But for me, breaking the sounds of the night, there's a new sound that's not the crickets or coy dogs or the owl. It's the first note of the first song of the first bird in the early, early morning. If you're outside, you look at the sky, you see that the stars have only just hidden themselves, and the sky's color has taken on the faintest suggestion of light. It's at that note that you know that the morning cannot be far away, and that nothing on earth can stop the rising of the sun. So my friends, let's hear it for Caleb Maupin.
Before we begin, why don't we all just stand up and stretch and breathe for just a minute? Stay in your seat and just stretch and breathe. Right? Right? I know a lot of us have a lot of stress in our lives. Some of us have midterm exams coming up. Some of us are involved in some of the important electoral campaigns that are going on right now. I know some of us, maybe you're worried about paying your bills. Well, you can forget all about that for the next 40 minutes or so. You're safe, and we're just going to have a short conversation about the problems facing the United States of America right now and what can be done about it. So, the theme for my presentation tonight is patterns, right? Patterns are all around us. The sun goes up, the sun goes down, the tide comes in, the tide goes out, spring, summer, fall, winter, then spring again, right? Then summer, then fall, then winter, right? Patterns are all around us, and part of the human experience, if you look at history, is people struggling to try and figure out those patterns in nature. The world is so full of chaos and insecurity, but people are trying to find out what they can know is going to happen next, to anticipate, to get some security, to get some peace. That's something we've been struggling to do. And one of the things that human beings have always done is they've told stories, right? We know about ancient Greek myths and legends. We know about some of the stories from the Native American tradition, some of the stories from Africa, some of the stories from ancient Europe. You know, myths and legends, stories, they have a special place in the human species. It's part of the way we point to higher truths. And I think that's just as true now as it was in ancient times. And there's one particular story that was written about 80 years ago that I think all of us here should still know pretty well. If I said to you, faster than a speeding bullet, faster than a locomotive, able to leap a tall building in a single bound, look up at the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman! Right? Superman was first written in 1939. My grandparents knew who Superman was, and I think it's pretty safe to say that my grandchildren are going to know who Superman was, right? It's a story that just speaks to us, right? So Superman, he's an alien from another planet, he's crash landed on Earth, he looks just like any other human being, but he's got superpowers, and he could rule the world if he wants to, but he doesn't. Instead, he lives a humble life as mild-mannered Clark Kent. He's got those glasses on and no one can recognize him. It's like the perfect disguise, right? And, you know, he goes around and instead of using his powers to rule over people and to oppress people, he uses his powers to protect the innocent, right? And he's a humble guy. He doesn't like violence. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. He just wants to live a decent life and protect those who are in need. Well, you know, around the world, Superman is actually considered to be a very American story, you know, and that not just Superman, but the whole genre of superheroes, Batman, Spider-Man, all of that is considered to be very, very American. And that gives me hope, because if Americans can love Superman, then Americans can love socialism. Bear with me, that might sound like a shock. I told you Superman was first written by two comic book writers in Cleveland in 1939. Well, one of Superman's first actions was to save a group of striking miners, right? These miners were on strike, their crooked boss was looking to go after them, so Superman flies in and rescues them. And those early Superman comics are full of statements against racism and condemning racism and bigotry. Now, today that might sound like just some lame liberal, you know, we hear that everywhere. Back in 1939, when Jim Crow segregation was still in effect and lynchings were taking place, the fact that this nationally syndicated comic book was denouncing racism was a very big deal. And don't forget that during the Second World War, in the radio version of Superman, Superman actually fought the Ku Klux Klan. Right? They called them the Knights of the Fiery Cross, and he fought against the Klan. Why? Well, the Second World War was going on, and fascism was the enemy, and the Soviet Union was the ally. And these Klansmen, they were admiring Hitler, and they were preaching racism, and they were dividing the country and helping the enemy. So Superman went into battle to fight the Klansmen. You know, Superman, and you know, wow, the next point I want to make, this is a good one. Who's Lex Luthor? Who's Lex Luthor? So he's a bald guy, a maniacally evil bald guy. He's using technology, but he's not using technology to make a better life for the people. He's using technology so he can rip people off and hurt the community and make super profits at the expense of everyone else. So basically, Lex Luthor is Jeff Bezos. And whenever Lex Luthor Bezos has another evil plot against the people, what does Superman do? He runs into the nearest phone booth, he changes his costume real fast, and he flies in to rescue the people. And who are the people? It's the working class. Those of us who just want to survive. Those of us who just want a decent life. Does anyone here know how you say the phrase "man of steel" in Russian? Yeah, and that wasn't an accident. At the time those comics were published, in 1939, the Communist Party of the United States had tens of thousands of members. And among the unemployment councils and the labor unions and the anti-fascist associations that they led, they had influence over millions of people. In fact, not far from here, just a few blocks up, begins the district that Vito Marcantonio represented in the US Congress. Vito Marcantonio was a friend of the Communist Party, a member of the International Workers' Order. He represented New York City, Harlem, in the US Congress. At that point, you know, a lot of amazing people were associated with the Communist Party. Paul Robeson, a very famous singer. Langston Hughes. In fact, Langston Hughes, the famous African-American poet, for the 1939 convention, or 1932 convention of the Communist Party, he actually wrote a poem, and it went like this. He said, "Put one more S in the USA, let's make it Soviet. Put one more S in the USA, oh, we can win it yet. Once the land belongs to the farmers and the factories to working men, the USA, when we take control, will be the USSA then." That was Langston Hughes, and that was 1932. And back at that point, early in the 1930s, the communists were always talking about Soviet America. They had a book toward Soviet America. But interestingly, the leaders of the Soviet Union told them to stop doing that. They said, Soviet's a Russian word. It's not an English word. And if you ever have socialism in the USA, you're not going to copy our system. You're going to do it your own way. It's going to be an American form of socialism. So the Soviets didn't like that. Now, sometimes the most educational events that you can go to are funerals, right? And I consider it a great privilege that when I was an activist 10 years or so ago in Cleveland, that I got to know some older communists. And there was one older woman who was about this tall that used to go to peace rallies with us. And she was mid-80s at the time that I knew her, and I actually then got to go to her funeral when she passed away, and I got to learn her whole life story. She had immigrated to the country from Lebanon when she was like 4 years old. She lived on the west side of Cleveland, and her father lost his job, and they were actually kicked out of their home. But then she remembers very vividly, one of her most vivid memories of childhood was when in 1935, when Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, and hired millions of unemployed people and gave them jobs, how they got their home back, the very home they'd been evicted from, they got back into their home. And I remember riding in the car with her to a peace rally and her explaining me and telling me this story about how Roosevelt had gotten them their home back. But then I pressed her a little bit and she said, well, it wasn't just Roosevelt. It was a mass movement of people behind him. And that's why she eventually joined the Communist Party, because there was no other organization in Cleveland on the west side in the late 1930s that did more to fight for unemployment, to fight for the rights of working class people, to oppose racism and bigotry, to stand with Roosevelt. No other organization did that stronger than the Communist Party. And it was, you know, it was just a touching story that she had to tell. And also, you know, at that point in world history, to admire the Soviet Union wasn't a hard thing to do, because at that point we were having the Great Depression in the United States. People were literally starving to death and hungry. But the Soviet Union had gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to, in 1936, they had electrified the entire country. They brought running water to the entire country. They put so much, they wiped out illiteracy. They'd done so much. You know, it's this crazy thing. It's like a cliche. You know, people say things without thinking about them, right? They repeat the same phrases over and over. This whole thing about socialism failed. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? Socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. The next time somebody says that to you, just say Sputnik, right? You know, who was the first country in outer space? The next time somebody says that to you, say AK-47 rifle, the most efficient rifle in history. Next time someone says that, say Tetris, right? You know, it's the weirdest thing. You get people saying, well, in socialism, no one ever produces anything. The Soviet Union produced more steel than any other country in the world. And today, half of the steel on Earth is produced in the state-controlled steel industry of China. So this idea that socialism just doesn't produce anything is absurd. Why is it that all over the world, people know about Cuba, a very, very small island? That's because of the medical volunteers that they send all over the world. In fact, people all over the world are studying their achievements. But no one acknowledges this, right? Even some of the voices defending socialism, well, they just won't go there. It's one of the most absurd things. But I came here tonight to talk about patterns, right? I don't want to get too far into that. So patterns, right? Patterns are one of the most important things in human mental health, according to some schools of psychology. I believe classical psychoanalysis tells us that there's two kinds of mental illness. There's neurosis and psychosis, right? People that are psychotic, you know, these are people that are in so much pain and so much suffering that they start seeing patterns that aren't there and trying to create a narrative, like a fictional narrative that they can write up about the world in order to protect themselves from their suffering. And then the more mild form of mental illness that's far more common is called neurosis, right? And people that are neurotic have the opposite problem, right? That's that old cliche that they have about people who make the same mistake over and over and over again, right? They can't notice any patterns. They keep repeating the same mistakes in their interactions with other people and in relationships. And they can't notice, they can't learn from their errors. Well, we live in a neurotic country, if there ever was one, right? I mean, look at what happened. Like, so do you remember George W. Bush telling us that those poor Iraqis, they were just so oppressed, right? They were just so oppressed. And he just wanted to go invade Iraq, just get those weapons of mass destruction and liberate those poor oppressed people. But look how Iraq has been ever since then. Can anyone in their right mind say that what the USA did in Iraq was liberation, made their lives better? But look at Afghanistan, right? That, we were told that the evil Taliban is there just oppressing people, and it's just so horrible, so awful. Look at Afghanistan now, like Maddie pointed out. It's the center of the global drug trade. Not only is the Taliban still there, we got ISIS, we got Al-Qaeda, we got the drug dealers. Has Afghanistan gotten better because of US military intervention? Look at Libya, right? It was evil Gaddafi. He was making people so miserable. Actually, they had probably the highest life expectancy on the African continent. But, evil Gaddafi was making life miserable. So now look at Libya. Now that Libya has joined the global capitalist system and become part of the global capitalist market, things are so bad that people are getting onto rafts and fleeing in the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe. I mean, this notion that the Pentagon is a humanitarian rescue organization that just goes around the world saving people is a fiction. And how many more times are we going to fall for this? But, people are also neurotic, I would say, not people, but the country's leadership, when it comes to economics, right? So the first major downturn in the US economy after the Second World War was in 1978, right? And when that happened, Ronald Reagan came in and he said, I'm going to make America great again by privatizing things, reducing the role of government, attacking labor unions. So Reagan came in there and labor unions were weakened. We know about the Patco incident, right? There was deregulation, and overall the standard of living in the United States started to decrease. And then there was an economic downturn in the 1990s. And again, Bill Clinton, who said he was a progressive, came in, got rid of welfare as we know it, right? He signed NAFTA, a horrendous trade deal that devastated not only this country, but also Mexico, Canada, all kinds of countries. And so then, leading up to the financial crisis, and this is the 10-year anniversary of the financial crisis, which I think, the 2008 financial crisis is going to be a definitive moment. I mean, it's definitive for me. I remember being in college and seeing the global capitalist economy collapse and having so many conversations about it. Well, 2008, what was happening in the lead up to it? So you had Alan Greenspan. And Alan Greenspan was sitting there in the Federal Reserve watching the standard of living in the USA decrease. And he was starting to panic because the spending power of average Americans was going down. People couldn't afford to buy things like they once had. So Alan Greenspan was there in the Federal Reserve, and he's saying, we've got to keep Americans spending. How do we keep Americans spending, right? You remember after 9/11, George W. Bush got on television. He said, if you want to defeat the terrorists, you got to go shopping. That's what you got to do. You got to go shopping. Run up that credit card. You got to defeat the terrorists by going shopping. Right? That was George W. Bush, right? But not only that, Alan Greenspan legalized all kinds of mortgage lending so people could keep buying houses even though their incomes had decreased, legalized all kinds of credit card practices that had been completely illegal before. The desperation was to keep Americans spending. And what's that about? Well, the reason for that is because at the very same time that our standard of living was decreasing, our wages were dropping, the good-paying industrial jobs were being eliminated, at the very same time that was happening, technology was advancing, right? The ability to produce products was greatly expanding. A global apparatus of production was growing, right? Human workers were being replaced by machines, and now we are producing products more efficiently than ever before in history. Right? It's amazing what they have done with artificial intelligence. I mean, they can churn out iPhones and iPads and all kinds of stuff. They've created this global system of production that is producing loads and loads and loads of products with fewer workers ever before. And this is a crisis of overproduction. And there's a book about it that was written a long time ago explaining it. It's called Capital. by Karl Marx. And he explains how the capitalist is always trying to make production as efficient as possible. Hire as few people, pay those people as little as possible, make the jobs unskillable, and this leads to what's called the falling rate of profit, because eventually the people can't buy back the products that they're producing, and you have a glut. The market is full of products that cannot be sold, and this is the built-in self-destruction of capitalism that Karl Marx wrote about. And you know, right now, Wall Street's doing pretty well. The stock market is doing great, right? And people look at that and they say, oh, the economy is doing well, right? Well, you know, the stock market is doing great, the stock market's rising, and Trump says, I'm doing it, I'm making America great again, it's coming true, like I'm fulfilling my promise, the stock market is rising, it's happening. But answer this question, is your life getting any better? No. Right? As our wages go down, and so many young people are stuck in low-wage jobs, is your life getting any better? No. As there's record debt in the United States, I'm talking household debt, I'm talking student debt, is your life getting any better? No. Well, if you answer that question, then you should realize that what we're having right now in the United States is not real economic growth. When the stock market is going through the roof, but average Americans are stagnant and not getting better, that's growth based on debt. That's fake economic growth. And that is the kind of growth that leads to a big fallout, because it's not real economic growth. But Trump says, you know, he's going to make America great again, right? And that he's going to put this big tariff on China. He's going to cut us out from one of the fastest moving economies in the world. He's not going to collaborate with them on technology, and somehow that's going to make the economy better. And I know there are a lot of people in this country that really want to believe him. They're not here in New York City, obviously, but there's a lot of people around the country who are in neighborhoods devastated by opioids, who have seen a rise in crime in their neighborhood, have seen the good-paying industrial jobs go away, and they want to believe him, and they're rallying around him. And there are some of us also, some of us who've gone down that, that Howard Zinn, Cornell West, Noam Chomsky corridor, right, that little rabbit hole. And we know about the history of the United States, and we know about slavery, and we know about the slaughter of the indigenous people, and we know about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And some of us, when we hear that slogan, "Make America Great Again," it just hits us in our gut. It just makes us sick, and we just get angry. It's like, what does he mean, make America great again? Is he going to do slavery all over again? Right? Is he going to do the Korean War again and kill another million people? Is he going to bring back Jim Crow? What is he talking about? Make America great again. It just bothers us, you know, there's this rage. You know, all my life, I remember when I was a college student, I would argue with people about politics. We'd be arguing about like the Iraq War or economics or something, and somebody would just blurt out, "America's a good country, okay?" And I'd be like, what does that have to do with anything? Right? And they'd be like, well, America, and it's this stupid jingoism that we get in the USA, that because of America, because of patriotism, you're not allowed to question the government, you have to go along with it, you're not allowed to oppose capitalism because of this stupid jingoism. And it makes you angry. And if you're somebody who can, you know, who can see through the lies, it makes you angry to hear that, right? And that's why a lot of leftists, I think, are out there burning American flags and are out there saying things like America was never great, right? It's a reaction, it's rage in response to that stupid jingoism that says you're not allowed to question the government because of American patriotism. You know, but you won't ever catch me doing that kind of thing anymore. And I'm going to tell you why. I'll tell you why. In 2015, I went to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it was a life-changing experience for me. And in 2015, not only did I get to visit Iran, but I participated in a humanitarian mission. I went on a boat from Iran to Yemen, and it was a boat from the Red Crescent Society. And we were trying to bring humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen, who are being bombed, and still to this day, bombed and destroyed by Saudi Arabia. I mean, hundreds of thousands dead. And, you know, I was on this ship for 13 days. And when you're on a ship for 13 days, and you're the only American on the ship, and there's only about 10 people on the ship who can speak any English, and you're seeing American warplanes flying above, and you're seeing Saudi jets, you know, and you're hearing reports about what's happening, and you're on your way to a war-torn country, that makes you think a lot. And your mind really starts to delve into spiritual matters, and what does your life mean, and what is it all about? And you know, we never reached Hodeidah, which was the port we were going to. And the reason we never reached it was because they bombed They bombed the port of Hodeida 8 times in a single day on the day we were supposed to arrive. Killed all kinds of dock workers. And on top of that, they bombed the medical university in Hodeida. And they killed medical students who were doing nothing but wanting to help other Yemeni people. And they killed them. And obviously, with the port that we were going to destroyed, and so many people dead, and reports that we would be attacked when we arrived, we had to turn the ship around. And we ended up going to Djibouti. And that was quite an interesting experience, my escape from Djibouti. I'll tell that story someday, but I'm not going to tell it today. Anyway, I got back to Iran. And when I got back to Iran, they gave me the opportunity to do something that very, very few Americans have ever done. And I actually got to see the supreme leader of Iran, the Grand Ayatollah Ali Syed Khamenei. And I was in this auditorium with about 20,000 people, and I was about 100 feet away from the supreme leader of Iran. That's something very few Americans have ever experienced. And I remember, I was there and I was with a lot of Chinese diplomats and diplomats from Africa, and we all had our earpieces on, and we're standing there in our suits, and we're very formal, and some of us had chairs, and we're standing there. And usually when I would go to Iran, I was surrounded by like the wealthiest people in the country. Like artists, writers, people that worked at TV networks, and people who worked for think tanks. But when I was in this auditorium with 20,000 people there to see the leader of the Islamic Revolution, I wasn't seeing the rich kids of Tehran. I was seeing working class Iranians. And when he came out onto the balcony, the supreme leader of Iran came out onto the balcony, he just walks out onto the balcony, the most gentle, he wasn't doing anything dramatic, just walks out. This audience just screamed in adoration. And people started sobbing, and moving back and forth, and it was like the most dramatic moment when the supreme leader walked into the room. And the reason for that was because if it weren't for the supreme leader of Iran, these people wouldn't have running water, and they wouldn't have electricity. They saw the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, they saw him as the one who fought for their interests against the rich and powerful. And so I stood there in this mausoleum with my earpiece on, and I listened to the speech. And it was interesting, because at the time, negotiations were taking place between the USA and Iran. The nuclear deal was taking place. So I stood there, and I'm listening to the conversation. And, he's going on. I remember he said that we oppose both the crimes of ISIS terrorists and the crimes of police brutality in the United States, because they're both the same, and you must always oppose brutality. And I remember he said that the westernized Islam that works with the USA and terrorist Islam are both distortions, and we have our true version in Iran. But there's one moment that I will never forget. One moment that just touched me, because he was talking about the negotiations that were taking place between the USA and Iran. And he said that these negotiations are taking place, that he was allowing the USA and Iran to negotiate around the nuclear issue. He said, but the USA and Iran would never be allies, he said. And he said that Iran would never align with American imperialism. And then something happened that I will never forget. Is he said that, which is commonly said in Iran, he said that the USA was the great Satan. And then I was the only American in an audience of 20,000 people who all began chanting in unison, "Death to America, death to America." And I stood there, and I froze, and tears went down my cheeks. I was just overwhelmed. And I think back on that moment. You don't forget a moment like that. You don't. And I stood there and I thought how horrible it is that this is what America means to people all over the world. The United States of America, to so many people, it doesn't mean, they weren't chanting death to my family. They weren't chanting death to people who just want to get by. To them, America meant war, and it meant grinding countries into poverty, and it meant destruction. That's what America meant to them. And when I heard them chanting death to America, I thought, God damn it, how dare these people call themselves America? How dare the billionaires and the bankers that run this country call themselves America? These are the forces that would cut food to children in the Bronx so that they can build drones and destroy people and kill people in other countries. How dare they call themselves America? These are the people that sold America down the river with so many trade deals. These people have nothing to do with America. What they stand for is global financial dictatorship. And what people around the world need to know is that there's two Americas. Yes, there's an America of Wall Street billionaires and bankers, and militarists and prostitute politicians, sure. But there's another America. There's an America of people who just want to survive and feed their kids and live a decent life. There's an America of all the people who fought for social justice around the world and stood against empire and war. There's an America of all the people who've organized for women's rights and LGBT rights and so many struggles for justice that have taken place. There's another America. And no, now is not the time to say, make America great again. Now is the time to build a new America. I think that we need a government of action that will guarantee Americans the right to education and health care. That's what I think. I think we need a government of action that will nationalize the oil. Right now we're in the middle of an oil boom. You know, they're producing 11 million barrels of oil in the United States, more than ever before. With fracking, there's so much oil. But yet we don't see any of the profits from the oil. The people who get rich from our oil and from our gas are people named like Rockefeller, DuPont, and Carnegie. We need a government of action that will say that's America's oil, that's America's gas, that's America's coal, that's America's timber, and it should be managed and the profits made from it should go to serve the people of America. We need a government of action that will work to provide education and actually, you know, there was a time where the United States was churning out some of the greatest scientists and engineers in the world. Why can't we be doing that now? Why are we so focused on bombing and destroying other countries? And why are we so focused? You know, I wasn't going to bring this up, but you know, China is doing this amazing project with the Belt and Road. They're going to developing countries, they're building infrastructure. Just recently, Trump signed a $60 billion deal, not to build infrastructure here, but to build infrastructure to compete with the Belt and Road. Meanwhile, China has offered, they want the United States to join the Belt and Road, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They want the United States. Rather than join with China's efforts, rather than have win-win cooperation, we're spending $60 billion to help build infrastructure somewhere else just to compete with China, to make it, you know, us or them. It's a stupid, stupid idea. But, you know, there's so much that needs to be said here. You know, Eugene Debs, the great socialist leader, he was arrested for giving an anti-war speech. He was put in prison for speaking up against World War I. And the speech that he was arrested for, which he gave, I mean, it's about the 100-year anniversary, contains this paragraph. And I want to read this paragraph from Eugene Debs' speech. And I do apologize, some of the language here is not modern. It's, you know, sexist, I guess you could say. But I'm just going to read this paragraph. He said, if you want to be respected, you have to begin by respecting yourself and look yourself in the face and see a man. Do not allow yourself to fall into the predicament of the poor fellow who, after he'd heard a socialist speech, concluded that he ought to be a socialist. The argument that he heard was unanswerable. Yes, he said to himself, all the speaker said was true, and I certainly ought to join the Socialist Party. But then after a while, he concluded that by joining the party, he might anger his boss and lose his job. And then he concluded, I can't take that chance. And that night he slept alone. And there was something on his conscience, and it resulted in a dreadful dream. Men always have such dreams when they betray themselves. But a socialist is free to go to bed with a clear conscience. He goes to sleep with his manhood, and he awakens and walks forth in the morning with self-respect. He is unafraid, and he can look the whole world in the face without a tremor and without a blush. That's Eugene Debs. Now, people don't talk that way anymore. And I think the reason, you know, that people don't talk that way anymore is because we've lost that notion. He's referring to the idea that people can make themselves better people by being part of a mass movement and organizing to build a better world. That's been lost in our society at this point. You know, people still worry about themselves, people worry how they are, but instead it feeds into a kind of chronic narcissism with Facebook and Twitter, and you know, people worry who they are, but this notion that we can be better people by coming together and organizing for a better world, it seems to have been lost in our society. And actually, I wasn't sure I was going to do this, but Sander actually inspired me.
Really?
Yeah, you know, but Sander, when you talked about socialism and Christianity, you made me think. Just got to find the paper I had here. Here we are. So, you know, I'm from a small town in Ohio originally. Almost everyone I knew in my little town was Republicans, conservatives. And people there were very, very religious. And I've had a lot of people, when you ask them about socialism or communism, the first thing that they say is, oh, well, that's anti-God or that's anti-Christian. So I wanted to just reflect on that for a moment because, I grew up in a Christian church. I was baptized and confirmed. And when we were getting confirmed, interestingly, we took 2 years of classes. And the first year we read the Bible. And the second year then we learned about the Reformation, Martin Luther and all that. But interestingly, we read the Bible, but there's a couple verses that we missed. To the north and the south, this is one of the verses that we just missed for some reason. To the north and the south, I saw a sign proclaiming death to the weakling and wealth to the strong. Anyone ever heard that voice before? And there's another one that said, there is nothing wrong with being greedy, as it only means that he wants more than he already has. Envy and greed are the motivating forces of ambition, and without ambition, very little importance can be accomplished. Anyone ever heard that voice before? Or the last one, man is just another animal, sometimes better, but more often worse than those who walk on all fours. Four Bible verses, I guess you could call them. We never read them. And you know why we never read them in my Sunday school class in Ohio? Because they're not from the Christian Bible. Those are from the Satanic Bible written by Anton LaVey. But I do have here with me the actual Bible, and I'll read you what the actual Bible has to say on the issue of socialism. Go now, ye rich, and weep, and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Behold the hired laborers you have reaped in your fields, which you work for by a fraud. They cry out to them that have reaped, and to those the abyss. Well, there you go, you get the message. So, I'll read another one, right? And there was a multitude that believed and were of one heart and of one soul. And neither said any of them aught to of things which he possessed, or his own, and they had all things in common. And neither among them was lacked, for as many possessors of lands and houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and distribution was made unto every man according to his need. Wow.
Acts chapter 5.
Yeah, and one more. He hath showed strength with his arm. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put the mighty down from their seats and exalted them of low degree. He hath filled them hungry with good things, and he has sent the rich away empty. Now, I know there are people here tonight who are Christians. I know there are people here tonight who are Jewish. There are people here tonight who are Muslims. There are people who have no faith whatsoever. And that's all fine by me. I think religion is a personal matter. It has no place in American politics. However, I'm reading that simply to point out that this notion that one has to be a follower of Jesus, one has to believe in capitalism, this is false. In fact, I would say, based on what I just read you, there is no reason that any follower of Jesus Christ should defend a system where profits come before people. There's a lot of 1960s radicals still walking around, and they're a lot different than those 1930s radicals that I just got to glimpse with my eyes. You talk to some of these old 1960s radicals, and they say things like, if you're talking about Ho Chi Minh, they'll be like, well, Ho Chi Minh was a freedom fighter, man. He was, fighting against imperialism, so of course the American media was demonizing him. But then you say, well, what do you think about what's going on now? And they'll say, well, Assad is killing his own people. We got to invade Syria. And, that Putin, he fixed our elections and all of that. And we say, well, they lied back then to justify wars. You think they might lie now to justify wars? They say, no. Back then our reporters were a bunch of squares like Walter Cronkite. Now we got hip reporters like Rachel Maddow. She's a lesbian, It's the weirdest thing. But on a more serious note, there's a 1960s radical leader named Jerry Rubin. I don't know if people are familiar. Well, Jerry Rubin, he was being interviewed, and he eventually became kind of a right-winger, but he was being interviewed, and they asked him what was the greatest accomplishment of the 1960s generation. And he said, the greatest thing we did is we got rid of the World War II mentality. And I hear that, and I think, got rid of the World War II mentality. During the Second World War, the United States aligned with the Soviet Union to defeat fascism. There was a feeling, that was the beginning of hope for the civil rights movement, because there was opposition to racism and fascism in the United States. During the Second World War, Roosevelt was the president, and he created Social Security and unemployment insurance. And towards the end of the war, Roosevelt even called for a new Bill of Rights to guarantee everyone jobs and housing and education. Why in the world would we want to get rid of the World War II mentality? It's the McCarthyist mentality. It's Joe McCarthy. That's the mentality, the 50s mentality that we need to get rid of. And to make matters worse, I'll even tell you this. There was a radical group in the 1960s they called the Weathermen. I don't know if people are familiar with them. Well, one of the leaders of the Weathermen was giving a speech at one of their conferences in 1969, 1970. And he said, "We want to appeal to the part of every kid who sympathizes with Lex Luthor and hates Superman." Well, forgive me if there's any children in the audience. I'm going to use some hip 1960s terminology and say, no fucking way! Right? I have no interest in aligning with Lex Luthor Bezos. I'm with Superman, I'm with Roosevelt, I'm with the Soviet people, I am for defeating fascism, and I am for building a better America for the people of the country. You know, I gotta tell you, it's been quite an interesting evening. You know, a lot of interesting words exchanged. I know all of us don't see eye to eye on every issue, and that's fine. And, you know, I want people to be able to come together, but I must say, as much as I'm opposed to racism, as much as I'm opposed to sexism and homophobia and every form of oppression, I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy the United States of America. I'm a socialist because I want to save the United States of America. This country needs to be saved from the greed of Wall Street imperialism and bankers and bosses. I want a better country, and I don't want a violent revolution. Violent revolutions are nightmares. Read some actual history books. Don't watch action movies. Don't watch Hollywood movies that fill you up with adrenaline and make you feel all fired up. Read some actual history of what goes on. When the situation gets so dire that there's a violent revolution, that is a situation none of us ever want to be in. I would prefer very much so that the people of this country come together and peacefully organize and get progressive folks elected and build a better country and fight against the Wall Street rich in a peaceful manner, right? Violence, left adventurism that they call it, punchism, Blanquism. If you read some actual Marx, if you read some actual Lenin, you read the writings of Stalin, others, they opposed that kind of thing. They weren't for that kind of thing. The understanding was that Marxists were opposed to violence. They favored a peaceful transition. However, they were not opposed to people's right to defend themselves, which is a basic human right. And if you look at the great revolutions of history, and I'm running out low on time, so I don't want to get into all of that, but if you look at the great revolutions throughout history, they're basically acts of self-defense. It's when people are backed up against a wall and have no choice, they defend themselves. And I desperately hope that we never get into that situation here in the United States of America. Now, on that point, I wanted to say, there's a lot of people who feel very apocalyptic these days, right? They feel like it's the end of the world. There's a lot of end of the world movies coming out, right? People have seen that. Well, you know, I don't feel like we're in the apocalypse, but I can understand why people might feel that way. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Marxist narrative of world history, but it goes like this, basically. You know, for most of human civilization, we were hunter-gatherers. We were in the woods, hunting and gathering. But then with our creativity and our brilliance, we got too good at hunting and gathering, right? We developed spears so we could hunt those animals very effectively. We were paying attention to the patterns and how berries were growing and fruits, and we knew how to gather very effectively. So with our brilliance, we got too good at hunting and gathering. And there was a scarcity. The animals were dying off. We weren't hunting them. The berries and all of that weren't growing. And there was a scarcity, and it was a crisis, and people started starving to death. It was a crisis, and the only way it could be resolved was with the first social revolution. When we started farming, domesticating animals, growing crops, right? That was the first social revolution that resolved the first big civilization crisis. Fast forward a few thousand years, right? The Silk Road from Asia and the invention of the printing press and other great, brilliant, human, creative inventions made us too good at subsistence farming. We were too good at subsistence farming. And there came a time that people were starving and there was a political crisis, and then we had the second great social revolution. We overturned feudalism and we got the capitalist world. And the problem that we're in today is that we've gotten too good at capitalism, right? They don't even need assembly line workers anymore. We have developed computers and artificial intelligence and 3D printers, and the global assembly line is empty of workers, and the global market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. We are in the greatest civilization crisis in the history of humanity right now because we have developed the mechanisms to build a beautiful, prosperous world. But the only way we can do that is if the major banks and factories and centers of economic power come under public control and are no longer operated to make a profit for a small group of billionaires and bankers. We need to have control over the economy. The means of production, to use Marxist terminology, must be controlled by the people. And until we get to that point, this civilization crisis that we're in, with people fleeing from developing countries, with wages dropping, with opioids, with war, it's only going to escalate until we can resolve this continuing civilization crisis, until we can have popular power control the economy. But I want to back up even further. Because, you know, I talked about human creativity making feudalism no longer sustainable. Well, that really began because throughout the Dark Ages, there was a feeling that human beings were animals, right? Human beings were simply existed to serve those above them, right? Serfs existed to serve the nobles, right? Commoners existed to serve the king. People were property, people were chattel. They had no obligation. Their obligation was to rule those above them, and those who ruled above them had no obligation to them. But human history started to advance. We got to see some great advances in human history. We got, Johannes Kepler and Bach and Leonardo da Vinci. We got all of that when there was a change in consciousness. The Renaissance was created when there was a change in understanding about how the government should operate. And the feeling was this, that not only did people have to serve those above them, but the government, the rulers, had an obligation to serve the people. Right? Populism. That's what populism is. They tell you populism is a bad word. That's what populism is. The notion that the government should serve the people. And that had a lot to do with the founding of this country. What are the first words of the preamble of the U.S. Constitution? We the people. And who is it who pays the taxes that pay for all their ugly wars while our country crumbles? We the people. And who is it who goes and does all the work of this country? We the people. And who is it who goes out and suffers as they continue to gut the place with their trade deals? Who is it? It's we the people. Well, it's about time we had a government of action that fought on behalf of we the people against the billionaires and the bankers. And I want to just quickly close with this. I like to talk about Superman. I like to talk about superheroes, but please don't get me wrong. The notion that there's going to be some superhuman flying from another country that's just going to come save us all is not what I want you to get out of my presentation tonight. That is not the message. We need millions of people in the United States to start talking about these ideas and to start getting involved in the political process. I could say I think we need millions of supermen and superwomen if we're going to get out of this crisis. So I hope that we're going to start having some weekly discussions and classes with our organization. I hope you'll get involved, and I hope that you've been inspired by what I said tonight.